Mike Wazowski is an interesting character in Monsters Inc. for what he is. Like, on the whole, he isn't strictly necessary. Despite Sully and Mike being the main duo that all the promotional material focuses on, the movie primarily focuses on the relationship between Sully and Boo. Mike, on the other hand, just wants the conflict of the story over with as quickly as possible, regardless of the method, and really has very little authority over the trajectory of the plot. Mike and his relationship with Sully is really more of a secondary concern, and really just there to give Sully someone to talk to, since Boo, lovable though she may be, is not really much of a conversationalist.
The guy making the ball!
If you really wanted to, you could remove Mike from the story altogether and you wouldn't have to change very many events.
I can't believe it.
But with that said, you'd be hard-pressed to find somebody who would want to remove him. I know I certainly wouldn't. But that's also interesting because for a lot of the runtime, he displays a lot of what seems like they would be fairly unappealing traits. He's egotistical, he's dismissive of the people around him, and he's honestly pretty selfish. So how does a character like that end up being one of Pixar's biggest icons? Well, let's first take a look at how he's introduced. Before the conflict of the movie comes into play about 20 minutes in, the more questionable aspects of Mike's personality aren't really delved into all that thoroughly. There are a couple of instances where they pop up, but they come and go in the span of about 1 or 2 lines of dialogue.
Those numbers are pretty sweet.
Are they? You know, I hadn't even noticed.
What we do get during that time is a sequence of Mike and Sully going through a typical day in their lives, and the audience is given plenty of time to be endeared by Mike. We see that he's a reasonably friendly and popular guy with his neighbors and co-workers, and that he's willing to go to great lengths to please his girlfriend Celia.
I just got us into a little place called, Harryhausen's.
We also see that he's an incredibly supportive friend to Sully and serves as a positive influence in his life.
The best refineries.
All of this adds up to portraying him as a very likable guy in his usual day-to-day life, and makes his occasional moments of ego really just feel like fleeting moments from an otherwise decent enough guy. But one advantage of a story where a character is thrust into conflict whether they like it or not is that it allows their otherwise barely perceptible flaws to come out in full force, and we get to see how those flaws interact with their usual personality. After Sully accidentally lets Boo loose into the monster world, putting the entirety of Monstropolis into a paranoid frenzy and implicating the two in a potential scandal that could ruin both their lives, Mike's friendliness towards Sully mostly gets replaced with bitter frustration and sarcasm every chance he gets.
Then why don't you find some place for it to sleep?
While I think of a plan!
Let's keep it. I always wanted a pet that could kill me!
What were they talking about, a machine?
Who cares?
Now, this reaction from Mike is somewhat understandable, albeit not the most constructive or sympathetic to his friend, who really just stumbled upon a door that shouldn't have been left active anyway. But Mike seems to think that he's being entirely justified and even claims to be holding back.
Sully, I'd like to think that given the circumstances, I've been extremely forgiving up to now.
Now, without being handled with care, this could make Mike look like kind of a really bad friend and paint his previous scenes in the movie in a more negative light. It could make his more positive interactions with Sully from earlier feel disingenuous, like he's really only nice to him when it's convenient for him. But there's one thing that Mike does throughout this portion of the movie that you might not even consciously realize, but it really does cement him as a true friend. Quite simply, he stands by Sully. Think about it. Everything that Sully and Mike struggle throughout the movie happens due to something only Sully was involved in. By all accounts, if Mike wants an easy out of this situation, which he clearly does, he could just rat Sully out to the authorities and save his own skin. But he doesn't do that. Throughout the movie, for all the complaining and panicking he does, desperate to get his life back on track, he's ultimately going along with all of it willingly, even putting his own future at risk by covering for his friend. Ultimately, what he wants is to break the scare record because it's a goal they've both been pursuing as best friends for years.
Look, you and I are a team. Nothing is more important than our friendship.
In fact, there are even a lot of moments in the story where Mike and Sully are given the option to escape the predicament they're in, and Mike will often be vouching to take it.
She got away from you again? This is perfect. She's gone.
But then Sully will either refuse to take the easier and more selfish way out, or he'll come up with a plan that could potentially put them at even more risk, but is still the right thing to do. And despite the fact that Mike adamantly disagrees with Sully, he still goes along with him, even while actively begging him not to go through with it.
Come on, somebody else will find the kid. It'll be their problem, not ours. She's out of our hair.
This eventually leads to the scene of Sully going to confide in Mr. Waternoose because he believes he can help. It initially goes a little bit rocky. Sully doesn't really get a chance to carefully explain what's going on, and as a result, the fact that he and Mike have Boo is just sprung on Waternoose without warning.
The child!
Now, as far as Mike and Sully are aware, Waternoose has nothing to do with the kidnapping plot that Boo was almost a victim of, but there is still a very clear risk that something could go wrong here. I mean, Monsters Incorporated has a potential legal scandal at stake due to a human child entering the monster world. So if the CEO just sees that child with Mike and Sully without context of why they have her, the two could be in major trouble, both professionally and legally. And yet, when it looks like things are all about to go wrong, Mike immediately steps in and commits to the plan that Sully brought him into.
She isn't toxic. I know it sounds crazy, but trust me.
It's a great example of how Mike will put his own well-being at stake because, above all, he's a loyal friend. He even appeals to Waternoose by getting him to sympathize with Boo, which he himself has been insisting against for the whole movie.
And he was gonna test it out on that sweet little girl.
As a side note, there's one other thing that I really like about how Mike is used in this scene, and it's how he's used for exposition. It's generally a rule in storytelling that you don't want to exposit something that the viewer already knows because, well, it's repetitive, which creates a potential problem for this scene. Mike and Sully making Waternoose aware of Randall's evil plot is something that needs to be conveyed to the audience in some way or another to move the story along. But it's also stuff that we literally just saw in the previous scene. So how do you get Waternoose informed without making the scene really boring? Well, by having Mike, the character who doesn't presently have an emotional stake in stopping Randall, be the one to explain it. All they really need to do is show a couple lines of dialogue to get the point across and have most of the conversation play out in the background. The focus of the scene is actually on this powerful emotional moment between Sully and Boo. It effectively strips the scene down to the bare essentials and instead fills it with something that the audience will actually want to see. But then we progress a little further into the movie. Just before the climax, Waternoose betrays Mike and Sully and effectively makes Mike's worst fears on the ordeal become reality.
We're banished, genius. We're in the human world.
Their lives, as far as they know, are ruined, and Mike can't help but be angry at Sully for letting it happen and for making him trust him against his own judgment.
Ever since that kid came in, you've ignored everything I've said, and now look where we are.
And this is where Mike cements himself as a likable character in spite of his selfishness. Essentially, we get to learn why he is like this. Throughout the movie, Mike's main concern has been finally breaking the all-time scare record, something he and Sully were incredibly close to doing. That might seem like a selfish thing to prioritize over a quote-unquote stupid kid, and it is selfish, but then Mike starts openly venting his frustrations to Sully.
Sully, what about everything we ever worked for? Does that matter?
And you realize that record was important to Mike because it was basically his life's work. So you can understand his reluctance to do the right thing since it would mean risking what he sees as the meaning in his life. And then we get confirmation of why Mike kept trying to talk Sully out of helping Boo.
I'm your pal. I'm your best friend. Don't I matter?
As much as Mike wants to just get his life back in order, he doesn't want to do it without Sully. And so when he sees that Sully has his goal set on doing the right thing no matter the consequences, it's hard for Mike to not see that as his best friend turning his back on everything they both worked so hard for, to the point where he can't bring himself to go along with him anymore.
Because you're on your own.
Sully parts ways with Mike only for him to eventually come back. Some might say that it's a little weird narratively that Mike makes the decision to come back off screen, but personally I don't think it's something that you necessarily need to see. Mike was angry because he just lost everything that he'd been trying to protect. Of course he's gonna be upset. But now that his career has been stripped away from him, the source of all of his selfish tendencies, he ultimately realizes what he can still keep and also what's most important to him, his friendship.
I'm glad you came back, Mike.
Somebody's got to take care of you big hairball.
And the fact that he's not worried about losing his job anymore means he no longer sees Boo as a threat. He's able to see her as a person like Sully was able to do. And in the rest of the movie, Mike shows the amount of growth he's gone through. During the climax, he distracts the CDA agents by getting them to chase him so that Sully can escape with Boo, putting himself at risk to save her. And in the epilogue, when Sully comes up with the concept of using laughs as a source of power instead of screams, who's the first person we see embracing that change? Yeah, so here we have a guy who, throughout the whole movie, wanted desperately for things to get back to normal, now actively going along with the changes being made. Not to mention the fact that after spending the whole movie trying to get rid of Boo, his final act in the movie was him going to extreme lengths to getting her back, all just to make his friend happy.
Mike.
Mike Wazowski is one of the best characters to come out of Pixar. His character arc may not be the deepest of any they've ever made. It wasn't really until Monsters University that Mike was really delved into.
I thought if I wanted it enough, I could show everybody that Mike Wazowski is something special.
But what he gives us is a great example of how a generally good-natured person can be led astray by their own ambitions, even if those ambitions may be rooted in their more likable traits. But he also shows how a person like that can reflect upon it and come back an even better person than they were before. Special thanks to my Patreon supporters Heather Reed, Zelda, Radio Peyo, and Moon Goddesses. Thank you so much for the support.